In today's lesson, we are learning how to convert fractions to percents and percents to fractions. We will begin by learning how to convert fractions to percents. When converting a fraction to a percent, we have two steps that we need to follow. The first step is to convert the fraction to a decimal. So we have to divide our fraction. To do this, we will put our numerator, or our top dog, in the house. So if we were going to divide 1/2, we would set up our division problem like this. 2 cannot go into 1, so I need to add a decimal point and a 0 and bring my decimal point up in my answer before I can continue. 2 cannot go into 1, so we put the 0 above the 1, but it can go into 10. 2 goes into 10 5 times. 2 times 5 is 10, and when we subtract 10 from 10, we're left with a remainder of 0. So now we know that 1/2 is equivalent to 5/10. Which we can see right here. Now that we've converted the fraction to a decimal, the second step is to convert the decimal to a percent. So if you remember our Dr. Pepper method, if I write my D and P for Dr. Pepper, decimals and percents, if I'm starting with a decimal, I need to move to the right to get to the percent. So I'm going to move the decimal 2 places to the right. 1, 2. Remember that if you have a blank space, that we need to fill it in with a placeholder of 0. So 1/2 is equivalent to 5/10, which is equivalent to 50%. And we're going to include our percentage sign in our answer. Now we will complete some guided practice problems together. Our first fraction is 13/5. So our first step to converting this to a percent is to convert our fraction to a decimal. To do this, we are going to put our numerator, or our top dog, in the house and divide. So I'm going to set up my division problem and divide. 5 cannot go into 1, so I'm going to put a 0 above the 1. But it can go into 13 2 times. So I'll put a 2 above the 3. And 5 times 2 is 10. When I subtract 10 from 13, I get a remainder of 3. We cannot stop a division problem until we have a remainder of 0. So in order to move on, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 to my dividend. I also need to bring my decimal point straight up in my answer, so I do not forget about it. Now I can bring down the 0 that I added and determine how many times 5 will go into 30. I know 5 can go into 30 6 times. 5 times 6 is 30. So now I'm left with a remainder of 0. So I know my decimal for this fraction is 2 6/10. So I'm going to fill that in. And now I need to convert this decimal to a percent. So I'm starting at the D in Dr. Pepper, and I need to move to the P, so I know I need to move to the right 2 times with my decimal point. 1 space, 2 spaces. Again, I have this blank space when I moved it over the second time, so I need to fill this in with a placeholder of 0. So my percentage is 260%. And I'm going to include my percentage sign in my answer. Next, we're going to convert the fraction 9/10 to a decimal. I'm going to go ahead and set up my division problem up at the top here. So remember that our numerator, or our top dog, needs to go inside the house. So I'm going to set up my division problem. And 10 cannot go into 9. 10 is bigger than 9. So in order to move on, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 and bring my decimal point straight up into my answer. 10 cannot go into 9, so we put a 0 above the 9, but it can go into 90. I know that 10 can go into 90 9 times. 10 times 9 is 90 exactly. So I'm left with a remainder of 0. So my decimal for this fraction is 9/10. Again, I know from my Dr. Pepper method that I need to move my decimal to the right 2 times to get to a percent. 1, 2. And again, I need to put a placeholder of 0 to fill in this blank. So my percentage would be 90%. And I'm going to include my percentage sign in my answer. My next fraction I need to convert to a percent is 2 3/8. When you have a mixed number like this, or a whole number and a fraction put together, I only need to divide the fraction. So I'm going to set up my division problem and put my numerator, or my top dog, in the house. And I'm going to divide. 8 cannot go into 3, so before I can move on, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 and bring my decimal point up into my answer. 8 can go into 30 3 times. And 8 times 3 is 24. When I subtract 24 from 30, I'm left with 6. I have a remainder of 6 left over, and I know that my remainder has to equal 0 before I'm done with my division problem. So I need to add another 0 to my dividend and bring it down. Eight can go into 60 7 times. And I know 8 times 7 is 56. When I subtract 56 from 60, I'm left with 4. Again, I have a remainder, so I need to add one more 0 and bring it down. Eight can go into 40 5 times exactly, because I know 8 times 5 is 40. So my decimal number is 375 thousandths. Remember how I said we only have to divide the fraction. What we can't do is forget about our two wholes. So instead of putting a 0 at the beginning of 375 thousandths, this is where I'm going to add in that whole number. So my decimal number for this fraction, 2 3/8, is 2 375 thousandths. Now I need to convert this decimal to a percent. And I know I need to move it over, my decimal point over 2 spaces to the right. 1, 2. So my percentage is 237 5/10%. I'm going to include my percentage sign in my answer. In our fourth guided practice problem, we are going to convert the fraction 2/3. I need to set up my division problem, so I'm going to put my numerator or my top dog inside the house. And 3 cannot go into 2 because it's larger than 2. So I need to put a 0 above it. In order to move on with my division problem, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 to my dividend, and then bring my decimal point straight up into my answer. 3 can go into 20 6 times. 3 times 6 is 18. When I subtract 18 from 20, I'm left with a remainder of 2. I need to have a remainder of 0 in order for my division problem to be done. So I need to add another 0 to my dividend and bring it down. Again, 3 can go into 20 6 times. 3 times 6 is 18. If I subtract 18 from 20, I'm left with a remainder of 2. So again, I'm going to add another 0 to my dividend and bring it down. 3 can go into 20 6 times. I'm noticing a pattern here. If I continue on with my division problem, it will never end, and I will always get a 6 when I'm trying to divide. So I have what's called a repeating decimal. Notice how I went 3 digits out with the repeating decimal. When we're converting to a percent, we want to make sure we go at least 3 digits out in our division problem. So my decimal for 2/3 is 0 666 thousandths. Next, I need to move my decimal point 2 spaces over to the right. Because again, I'm starting with a decimal, and I need to move towards the P in Dr. Pepper over to the right. So I'm going to move my decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So my percentage is 66 6/10%. But remember how I said it was repeating, and it will go on and on. So I'm going to add a line above this last 6 to the right of the decimal. This line means that it will continue repeating forever. In my next problem, I'm going to divide 17 ninths, and I'm going to set up my division problem up here at the top. So I'm going to place my numerator, or my top dog, inside the house. Nine cannot go into 1, so I'm going to put a 0 above the 1, but it can go into 17 one time. 9 times 1 is 9. 17 minus 9 is 8, but I still have a remainder, so in order to keep going, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 to my dividend and bring my decimal point straight up in my answer. Now I can bring the 0 that I added down and figure out how many times 9 can go into 80. I know 9 can go into 80 8 times. 9 times 8 is 72. When I subtract 72 from 80, I get a remainder of 8. So again, I need to add a 0 to my dividend and bring it down. Nine can go into 80 8 times, and 9 times 8 is 72. When I subtract 72 from 80, I get a remainder of 8. I'm noticing a pattern here. So I'm going to add one more 0 and bring it down. Again, 9 can go into 80 8 times. Notice how I'm going 3 digits out from the decimal point because I know I have a repeating decimal. So 9 times 8 is 72, and I'd have a remainder of 8. If I kept on dividing, I would continue to get a remainder of 8 forever. So my decimal for 17 ninths is 1 and 8 repeating. But I'm going to add in those 3 8s off to the right of the decimal, because now I need to convert this decimal to a percent. In order to do that, I'm going to move my decimal point 2 digits to the right. 1, 2. So my percentage is 188 and 8/10, repeating. I'll put my line up at the top, percent. And I need to make sure I'm always including that percentage sign. Otherwise, it's just a regular number. Lastly, we need to convert 3/12 to a percent. So first I need to divide it to convert it to a decimal. So I'm going to put my numerator inside the house. And 12 cannot go into 3. So I'm going to put a 0 above the 3, and before I can move on, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 to my dividend, and then bring my decimal point straight up into my answer so I don't forget about it. 12 can go into 30. 12 can go into 30 2 times. 12 times 2 I know is 24. And when I subtract 24 from 30, I'm left with 6. Now I have a remainder So I can't stop my division problem. So in order to move on, I need to add a 0 to my dividend and then bring it down. "12 can go into 60 5 times. Exactly. 12 times 5 is 60. So now when I subtract, I'm left with a remainder of 0. So my decimal for 3/12 is 25 hundredths. Now I need to convert my decimal to a percent. So I need to move my decimal to the right 2 times. 1, 2. So my percentage is 25%. Now we're going to do one guided practice word problem together. In this problem, it says, a gardener watered 4/5 of her yard. What percentage is equivalent to the fraction of the yard the gardener watered? So first I'm going to write the fraction down. 4/5. Now I need to convert this fraction to a percentage. Well, I know first I have to convert it to a decimal. So I'm going to set up my division problem and put my numerator inside the house. I know 5 cannot go into 4. So I'm going to put a 0 above the 4, and in order to move on, I need to add a decimal point and a 0 to my dividend and bring my decimal point straight up into my answer so that I don't forget about it. 5 can go into 40 8 times. And I know that 5 times 8 is 40. When I subtract 40 from 40, I'm left with a remainder of 0. So my decimal for 4/5 is 8/10. Going back to our Dr. Pepper method, if I'm starting with a decimal and I want to move to a percentage, I need to move to the right 2 times. So I'm going to move 2 spaces over to the right with my decimal point. 1, 2. I see a blank, so I need to put my placeholder of 0. So 4/5 is equivalent to 8/10, which is equivalent to 80%. So the gardener watered 80% of the yard. Now we're going to learn how to convert percents to fractions. Percent means out of 100. When converting a percent into a fraction, we will write the number over 100. After we write our fraction, we need to simplify. In the example to the right, we see 75%. We know that percent means out of 100. So the fraction was written as 75 over 100. But now we need to simplify that fraction if we're able to. So we know we can divide 75 and 100 by 25. When we do that, we can simplify this fraction to 3/4. So 75% is equal to 3/4. The other option to convert a percent to a fraction is to convert the percent to a decimal first. Then convert the decimal into a fraction. Now we will complete some guided practice problems together. Our first guided practice problem shows 34%. We know that percent means out of 100. So I'm going to make my fraction 34 over 100. Now I have to simplify if possible. I see that both of these numbers are even numbers. Whenever you have even numbers, they can always be divided by 2. We always want to make sure when we're simplifying fractions that we're dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, because fractions like fairness. So if we were to divide both 34 and 100 by 2, we would get 17 over 50. Now, if we were able to simplify this even further, we would, but I know that 17 is a prime number, which means that it can only be multiplied by 1 and itself, and I know that 50 cannot be divided by 17, so my fraction is in its simplest form. So 34% is equivalent to 17/50. Next, let's convert 6% to a fraction. So I'm going to put 6 over 100. Again, I notice that both of these numbers are even numbers, so I can divide both of them by 2. When I do that, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. This fraction is now in its simplest form because I cannot divide 3 and 50 by the same number to make it smaller. So 6% is equivalent to 3/50. Most of the time, we can convert percents to fractions by placing it over 100 and simplifying. But whenever you see a percentage with a decimal point, that's when we have to use the other way of converting. So first we need to convert 12.5% to a decimal and then to a fraction. So I notice that the decimal point is already in my answer, or is already in my number, so I need to move it 2 places to the left to convert it to be a decimal. Remember our Dr. Pepper method. If I'm moving from a percentage to a decimal, I need to move to the left 2 spaces. So that's what we did. So 12.5% written as a decimal is 125 thousandths. Now that we have our decimal number, we can write our fraction the way we would say our decimal number out loud. So how I would say this number is 125 thousandths. So I'm going to write 125 over 1,000. Now I need to simplify my fraction if possible. I know that 125 and 1,000 can both be divided by 125. We can divide by smaller numbers and continue to simplify as well until we get to the smallest number. When I divide 125 by 125, I'm left with 1. When I divide 1,000 by 125, I get 8. So my fraction is 1/8. Next, we're going to convert 130%. So I'm going to put 130 over 100. Here's a quick tip. If you are dividing two numbers and they both end in a 0, as long as we're fair to both sides, we can eliminate a 0 on both sides. So now my fraction is 13/10. But I notice that my numerator is bigger than my denominator. So I need to convert this into a mixed fraction so that it is proper. So my denominator shows that I need 10 parts to make a whole. I have 13 parts. So if I subtract 10 parts, then I've subtracted out a whole. So 13 minus 10 is 3. When I subtract out that whole, it's not going away. I'm going to keep it, but it's now not part of my fraction. So 13 minus 10 is 3, and I'm still going to keep my same denominator. So 13/10 is equivalent to 1 3/10. Now let's convert 62% to a fraction. Percent means out of 100. So again, I'm going to write my percent over 100. And I notice that both of these numbers are even numbers. So I know I can always divide even numbers by 2. (62) divided by 2 is 31. 100 divided by 2 is 50. There are no other numbers that I can divide my numerator and my denominator by, so my fraction for this percentage is 31/50. Last, we're going to convert 205% to a fraction. So I'm going to write 205 over 100. And now I need to simplify. I know I can divide 205 and 100 both by 5. (205) divided by 5 is 41, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. Notice how my numerator is larger than my denominator, so I have an improper fraction. I need to convert this to be a mixed number so that it is proper. So if I need 20 parts, my denominator, to make a whole, and I have 41 parts, I need to figure out how many times 20 can fit inside of 41. Well, 20 times 2 is 40. So I know that 20 can fit inside of 41 2 times. So that would be my whole number. 2 times 20 is 40. So if I subtract 40 From 41, I'm left with 1 as my remainder. And then I would keep my same denominator of 20. So 41/20 is equivalent to 2 1/20. Last, we're going to complete a guided practice word problem together. This word problem states about 35% of the people who go to the fair eat corny dogs. What fraction of the people do not eat corny dogs? So my percentage is 35%, and I need to convert this to a fraction. So I know percent means out of 100. So I need to write my percent, 35% over 100. Now I need to simplify if possible. I know that 35 and 100 can both be divided by 5. "35 divided by 5 is 7. 100 divided by 5 is 20. There are no other numbers that I can divide both 7 and 20 by to make my fraction simpler. So my fraction is 7/20, which makes 35% equivalent to 7/20. Now it's your turn to complete some independent practice problems on your own. You will have an opportunity to check your work, but only after you complete and submit your independent practice.